Hey you. Yeah, you forkin' asshole. Do you think you're a good person? Oh yeah? Why exactly? What is a good person anyway? Or rather, what makes a person good? We might look to Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or Immanuel Kant. These are just a few thinkers said to be foundational in the area of moral philosophy. Morality is a topic of philosophical discussion that goes back centuries. It is perhaps the central most important discussion of humanity. Of course, it's important to remember that a heck of a lot of people have been left out of that discussion throughout the ages. And that historical fact has kind of warped our attitudes about morality itself. Just something to think about there. Now, you might be skeptical if I said there's a half-hour comedy program on a major network that critically interrogates the idea of morality as a concept. And, well, you'd be entirely right to be skeptical about that. But bear with me here, okay? Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. In this installment, I'll be talking about a sitcom on NBC called The Good Place. This is a show with a very strange premise, especially for a major network like NBC. Ostensibly, this is a show about this thing we call the afterlife. You know, the idea that after our bodies die, our souls persist in some ethereal realm. Specifically, The Good Place is about the afterlife of Eleanor Shellstrop, the show's protagonist, played by Kristen Bell. After her untimely demise, Eleanor is delightfully surprised to find herself in the so-called good place. It's not quite the Judeo-Christian notion of heaven that we might immediately call to mind due to frequent depictions in pop culture, though it is presented to Eleanor as a positive environment that she's earned by living a good life. But Eleanor quickly learns that there's been a bit of a mix-up. It turns out that she doesn't actually belong in the good place. In fact, she's really kind of a terrible person, as evidenced by various flashbacks of her time on Earth. An entity called Michael, played by Ted Danson, is the designer and manager of the good place. Over the course of the first season, Eleanor attempts to hide her immoral tendencies and become a better person with the help of Chidi, a recently deceased professor of ethics and moral philosophy, played by William Jackson Harper. She also interacts with other residents, including Tahani and Jason, played by Jamila Jamil and Manny Jacinto, respectively. Sounds like a solid comedic premise, right? Well, I would say that the show is a bit more complex, and there might, I dare say, be something quite interesting lurking beneath the surface of this quirky little half-hour show. Now, per usual, I am obliged to say that you should watch the series before finishing the rest of this video, and I'm serious about this one. Do not watch beyond this point if you have not seen the full 2 seasons. I'll wait. Okay, so if you're still with me, you know that the setting presented in the show is not, in fact, the good place. It's actually quite the opposite. It's, the bad place. Michael is actually a demon tasked with torturing people sent to the bad place. And while demons traditionally resort to more, shall we say, medieval practices when it comes to making their victims suffer, Michael fancies himself an innovator. One might even say he's the Jeff Bezos of the bad place, except, perhaps a bit less evil. Michael has designed a personal hell for Eleanor, Chidi, Tahani, and Jason. In fact, he's chosen these people specifically because of their chemistry together. Or perhaps it would be better to say, lack thereof. According to Michael, they should, theoretically speaking, torture each other by virtue of their own clashing personalities. The plot twist towards the end of the first season will draw inevitable comparisons to Jean-Paul Sartre's play No Exit, a work I've talked about a couple of times on my channel. No Exit is a depiction of the afterlife, specifically that of a certain kind of hell, in which 3 characters are locked in a room together for eternity. By virtue of their own conflicting personalities, the characters live in a kind of existentially horrifying state of torture. The characters are all doomed to see themselves, and in a sense, define themselves, in relation to one another for eternity. The play is said to explore a certain philosophical problem, namely, we're all sort of trapped in an inescapable situation by virtue of our existence in relation to other people. Hence the line, hell is other people. We are subject to how others perceive us, or rather, we're subject to the very idea that others can perceive us, if that makes any sense. Look, I'm not really doing the play justice. You should just read it. There's a link in the video description. So, much like No Exit, The Good Place presents a vision of the afterlife in which each of the four central characters' very existence in relation to one another serves to torture each of them, respectively. Chidi is tortured due to the moral predicament he's put in by having to conceal Eleanor's status as someone who doesn't belong in the good place. Jason is tortured at first by the pressure to live modestly as a monk. And then, well, you might say he's tortured by his inability to really understand what's going on. Tahani is subject at first to Jason's silence. She's also got a few inner demons pertaining to her family that manifest in various ways. And Eleanor is tortured by, well, everything. Chidi's moral pedantry, Tahani's condescension, Jason's general, dullness. Perhaps more than anything else, though, the fundamental discomfort of each character stems from the fact that they're made to feel as though they don't belong. Eleanor's very presence creates weird effects in the good place. For instance, she steals some shrimp at a dinner party, and the very next day, a flock of giant floating shrimp appear in the sky. At another point, it begins raining garbage because Eleanor has put off her supposed duties as a trash cleaner. Her existence as a person in the good place creates disorder. But, of course, keep in mind that this is all a spectacle designed by Michael. The chaos is part of a narrative that he's deliberately constructed in order to torture Eleanor and the others. Moreover, the idea of soulmates is perpetuated in order to torture the characters. Particularly in this context, the very notion of soulmates works in a pernicious and devious way. Since the characters are matched with people intentionally for the purpose of torturing them, the very idea that they are supposed to be a perfect match works to exacerbate the situation. They're made to feel as though they should be happy, and thus their feelings of alienation create a dissonance that makes them suffer even more. This is some next-level psychological torture right here. It is an interesting experience rewatching the first season in light of all this information. A lot of foreshadowing elements are made apparent by doing so. For instance, at one point in the first episode, Eleanor explains that her parents divorced when she was very young, and she speculates that they're being used to torture each other in the bad place. This would appear to be an ironic reference to the fact that this very situation is applicable to her. She's being used to torture other people, and the people around her are being used to torture her. Based on what I've said thus far, one might suspect that the show is a comedic sort of interrogation of our expectations vis-a-vis the afterlife. This is probably true to some degree. After all, any notion of divine paradise seems fraught with all sorts of problems and contradictions. But I think the series might provide a bit more commentary about our own society than one might initially expect based on the show's premise. One of the foremost themes of the show is morality and how people perceive morality. It is interesting then that the system depicted in the series is morally dubious at best. It is important to note that values are imposed on all of the central characters. For instance, the physics of this universe actually prevent them from swearing. When they first arrive, the characters are shown a movie explaining how the point-based system works. It is described as using a, quote, perfectly accurate measurement system. Chidi later reifies this notion, claiming that the formula is infallible. Of course, he doesn't know that for certain. Even by the end of the second season, the metric by which people are judged in this system remains somewhat mysterious. It is a system by which certain actions are deemed good, in which case points are rewarded, and certain actions are deemed bad, in which case points are deducted. It does raise a number of questions. Are these standards absolute? Are they subject to some kind of unseen market force? There's really no way of knowing, but this point system is worth a bit of critical discussion, I think. As best I can gather, there is no obvious logical coherence to the standards of the system. For instance, one will be deducted a few points famous for being a fan of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. To be sure, this is played for laughs, but as I think should be clear by now, there's a bit more going on in the show than is readily apparent. So, it's worth asking, is liking the Red Hot Chili Peppers an indication of some kind of moral failing? For all their faults, I think most would agree that the central characters are not depicted as wholly bad people. At times, each of them displays traits of selfishness, neuroticism, stupidity, and vanity, but they also display kindness, conscientiousness, love, and even selflessness. Are we, the viewers, to believe, given the previous deception in the first season, that the moral standards of this system come down merely to which of these traits are exhibited more frequently than others? Is it really just a game of numbers? There are, of course, larger forces at play in this universe, and they are not unlike the forces at play in our own. Importantly, these are forces outside of the character's control. Let's consider the show's protagonist. Eleanor was an only child, her parents were divorced, and she was raised by a mother that was, by all accounts, absolutely terrible to her. We can gather that the other characters have similar narratives that intimately shape their supposed moral defects as well. So, how does agency really play into this? Is this system legitimate, or is it a farce? Who decides what the rules are? There is no sense in which the point system in the show is rooted in any kind of democratic order. By all indications, this is an autocracy. However, the God figure in this series is notably absent. One gathers that there is an elaborate sort of bureaucracy, levels of management, and red tape in the way of us actually meeting the divine ruler. But perhaps more importantly, the type of morality imposed on the characters in this series is that of the writers who craft the narrative. In fact, many of these oddly specific standards, for instance, one is deducted points for liking clam chowder, these are really just pet peeves of the writers. This is the inescapable tyranny of the show. As stated, the four central characters are thrust into a precarious situation, made to feel as though they don't belong, as though they'll be found out and sent to the bad place at any moment. Eleanor in particular is made to feel this way. Michael has designed the so-called good place such that it induces a kind of imposter syndrome. This very component of her torture is the mechanism that theoretically should have helped to keep this whole system going. This dynamic pressures Eleanor to focus her critical thinking abilities on not being found out, but her ability to cut through the bullshit wins out in the end. Eventually, she does figure out what's really going on. It is ironic then that Chidi calls Eleanor self-obsessed towards the beginning of the series. It is actually her own canny sense of practicality that ends up saving the day. And by my estimation, Chidi's devotion to the idea of ethics, rather than a practical sense of action, is its own form of narcissism. Chidi, for all his intellectual prowess, and in light of the fact that he clearly is a very considerate individual, he leans far too heavily on analytic philosophy to make decisions. He privileges theory over action, and of course, this is why he has so often found himself utterly paralyzed when presented with what any other person would perceive as a simple choice. Others suffer as a result. One might say there is a form of hyper-banality at play, a kind of exaggerated depiction of the more mundane aspects of contemporary life. In the machinations of the world's design, we see the empty signifiers of
capitalism.
For instance, the endless chain of frozen yogurt restaurants, establishments whose names constantly change. It is a world of shifting labels with one emerging constant: human misery. Such conceits are accepted as a matter of fact until they are later revealed for what they really are: fabrications of a bureaucrat working for a system that is designed to torture the people determined to be morally defective. Moreover, the central characters are constantly threatened by the prospect of eternal damnation. Michael, in turn, is tortured by the prospect of oblivion should his project fail. Conversely, those who act good by the standards of the system are given the promise of eternal paradise, though one gets the sense that it is relatively rare that one gets into the actual good place. I mean, does it ever even happen? Michael is the picture-perfect image of a middle manager. He represents the bad place, and therefore his interests are directly at odds with the central characters. I mean, that's obvious, right? He's meant to torture them. But eventually, Michael does come to sympathize with the people he's meant to manage. This is by virtue of his failure to design an ideally torturous world. As such, his interests shift. But this occurs also by the mere circumstance that he happens to work in close proximity to the four central characters. He eventually comes to view them as friends, and a sort of camaraderie develops between the group. By attempting to innovate certain archaic practices, Michael has spurred a process that just might lead to the demise of the system itself, or at least that's my suspicion. But why has such an abrupt paradigm shift emerged from his experimental project? I would say it is a phenomenon somewhat akin to industrialization. The emergence of factories and modern technology in society has certainly alleviated a lot of the arduous work that was previously necessary to meet demands, at least for some people. Although with industrialization, workers then necessarily shifted to more tedious, repetitive jobs. And sure, there's a spectrum and some jobs require creativity and all that. The point here is that modernity has brought about a tendency on the demand of humans to shift from physical to mental tasks. It should come as no surprise then that along with this new epoch came the emergence of unions. Workers oftentimes realized they were being exploited and subsequently banded together in order to fight for higher wages and better working conditions. Now let's bring it back to Michael's project, the so-called good place. Instead of being tortured with, say, hot pokers, victims are made to experience a more nebulous kind of emotional discomfort. But here's the thing Michael failed to predict. Because his method of torture relies on psychology instead of plain old physical torture, it necessarily relies on the victim's ability to think. You follow me? You know, it's pretty difficult to have a coherent thought if you're being prodded with sharp objects. But Michael's project is actually contingent upon the victim's ability to think for themselves. As such, they now have the ability to communicate with other victims and, to some extent, share their experiences. They have the wherewithal to realize what's actually happening, i.e., that they're being systematically tortured. So, Michael's goal at the start of this whole thing was to create a self-perpetuating system in which these four people torture one another forever. However, Michael's calculations were incorrect. Every time they restarted the scenario, the central characters ended up coming together and helping one another. In my view, the show demonstrates the immense difficulty of being what we might consider a good person in a framework that is, at best, amoral, and at worst, patently immoral. People's worth cannot be so easily quantified, and a concept that perhaps at this point should be considered central to morality is the idea of working together and sharing experiences in order to foster mutual understanding. I think those are just a few major takeaways from The Good Place. So anyway, if you're wondering what I think of all this morality stuff, well, to be totally clear, I do think there are universal moral values. I'm not a moral relativist, someone who thinks that morality is purely subjective and one person's morality is just as valid as another's. But I also think we should be extremely skeptical of those in positions of authority who attempt to dictate morality from above. Moreover, it's important to consider the material conditions that shape our attitudes about morality. Part of what I find appealing about The Good Place is that it doesn't condescend to its audience about morality, and perhaps more importantly, it doesn't come off as preachy either. It's actually a show that plays with philosophical ideas in such a way that it just might get people to think a bit more critically about morality itself, and it might even work to make viewers question some of their assumptions. It does all this while managing to be entertaining as well, I think, which is an impressive feat. Now, here's an intriguing tidbit of behind-the-scenes information about the show that I think is worth sharing. I read an interview with Kristen Bell in which she claims that the creator, Michael Schur, has a 7-season arc planned for the series. She says, and I quote, "I have heard the pitch for season 2 and season 3. because much like the finale, before I signed on to the project, he sat me down and said, here's what I want to do with the whole season. And because he's a great creator and he said, I feel irresponsible giving an actor this job and pulling the rug out from under them in the finale and changing the whole show. So I want you to know what's going to happen. And then you can decide if you want the part. So we had the whole thing planned out. And because it's such a weird show, because there are these unearthly, heavenly elements and different places you can go, he wants to do the whole thing. So he actually pitched me the second season, the third season, and whatever the seventh season would be. His brain is bigger than I could ever imagine. I believe this was stated shortly after the premiere of the second season, and well, I have to say that I was initially skeptical that they could really keep the show going for that long. The nature of the show at that time just seemed inherently limiting, and I'm really not a huge fan of shows sticking around long past their expiration date. But having seen the remaining episodes in the second season, it actually seems to me like a promising venture. I'm excited to see where they go from here. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. If you enjoy my videos and have a few bucks to spare, please consider supporting me on ko-fi.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Any donation, large or small, would be highly appreciated. Thank you for watching, and good night.